The election is just a few days away, and the Fox propaganda network is doing everything in its power to sanitize and launder Donald Trump's long history of authoritarian threats against his political opponents, and we have to talk about it. But before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, I didn't know if I was going to do a video about this, but I saw this clip the other day, and I've been kicking it back and forth. And the more I think about it, the more I think it needs to be discussed. So Martha MacCallum is a conservative Republican on Fox News. And she, again, without being Laura Ingraham or Sean Hannity or Jesse Waters, like Martha MacCallum's in the next tier down. She pretty clearly supports Donald Trump and grades him on a curve, right? I would say she's more egregious about it than somebody like Bret Baier. And so she's kind of like that mid-level, MAGA sycophant at Fox. There are many who are worse. And then there are people like Bret Baier and certainly Neil Cavuto who are much better, at holding Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans accountable without being quote unquote liberal. I digress. The thing is, as the elections draw near, she is ramping up the sycophancy, and bending over backwards to accommodate Donald Trump's rhetoric and his narratives and to sanitize and launder and sane wash all the unhinged things he said. So here, this is a clip of her interviewing a Democratic Congresswoman, Debbie Dingel, who, recently made comments on CNN that she fears that Donald Trump may try to lock her in an internment camp if he becomes president again.
I've suggested that if elected, former President Trump would put you in an internment camp. What makes you think that?
Okay, I cracked that. I mean, I will be serious and say I said that as a joke.
Okay.
Because I am reminding members sort of as a joke because the president has made it very clear he's going after his political enemies. And it is well documented what he has gone after me on numerous times because he doesn't agree with what I've said or what I've done. I try to be respectful.
So you don't really think you're not really living in fear that that's going to happen to you?
I have to say something to you, Martha. I don't know what it means to be on his political enemy list, to be called the enemy from within when he's talked about using the military against his political enemies. I hope right now that, on this show might even... Do you want me to tell you the truth? I don't know what he means sometimes when he says things.
Well, he has said also that he wants his success to be his revenge if he is reelected.
So this is the problem. He says one time that my real retribution will be my success, compared to all the other times that he's repeatedly threatened to use the military against his opponents. And this is what Fox does. They say, okay, Donald Trump says 10 things. And sure, nine of them are unhinged. Sure, he talks about immigrants poisoning the blood of our country, about, radical, communist, Marxist, fascist Democrats. We need to root them out. They're like vermin. He talks about his political opponents and critics being the enemy within, against whom he might need to deploy the military and the National Guard. And he mentions Democratic politicians like Debbie Dingel's peers like Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi. He name drops them specifically. So not nebulous far-right rioters, because Schiff and Pelosi were never a BLM protest. They were never rioting. They're just people who are politicians who disagree with Donald Trump. And he talks about all these things. But every now and then, he'll say something like, okay, my real retribution is I'm going to be a successful second-term president. And then Fox pounces. They're like, that one time is what he meant all the other 9 times, except, sure, he didn't say that, but that clearly must be what he meant. That is so disingenuous, so dishonest. You could do that with any fascistic figure throughout the totality of history. You could cherry pick certain statements that they said which sounded benevolent or benign. And if you cherry pick those examples and disregard the bulk of what they said and did, it would lead you to some pretty ridiculous conclusions about people like Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and, others. Not every terrible, evil, authoritarian person has only ever exclusively said bad things. But this is what Fox does. Well, sure, the enemy's within against the military, but what about that time that he said his real revenge would be his success? Really, Martha? Really? And would you be so gracious? Again, if the shoe were on the other foot, if it had been Kamala Harris or Joe Biden who said, again, on an average 10 things, and 9 of them were terrible. But the one time they said something benign or benevolent, would you give them the benefit of the doubt as you do Trump? And if others gave them the benefit of the doubt, would you accept that, or would you make fun of people and criticize people for like, why are you skipping over these 9 things for this one benevolent thing and pinning everything on that? Fox can't live by its own standard. Fox can't hold Trump to the same standard it holds Democrats to. They can't do it. This entire MAGA movement, this entire right-wing movement from politics to the media relies on double standards, blatant double standards that they barely try to hide if they try to hide it at all. And Debbie Dingel, listen, she's been getting roasted by a lot of people, including, again, Jake Tapper, who is obviously no fan of Trump's. Oh, aren't you exaggerating? I mean, listen, like I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'm not putting a probability on Donald Trump rounding up politicians and putting them in internment camps. But by the way, it doesn't have to be more than 50%. It doesn't actually have to be greater than 50% for it to be a problem. The fact that you had a former president and current Republican Party leader, current Republican nominee for president of the United States, who is a coin flip away from the presidency, the fact that he is even threatening to do this is beyond the pale and objectively disqualifying. It's insane. The fact that the threat is greater than 0%, that Debbie Dingel and Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi will be hunted down by the military if Donald Trump wins a second term, the fact that that's not literally 0% unlikely is a problem. And Axios talks about this, the enemies within list. Trump's enemies within list. Donald Trump has been radically transparent in his pledge to use and abuse the power of the presidency to seek retribution against Americans he believes has wronged him. The final weeks of the election have been consumed by Trump's bellicose vows to crush the enemy within, language that critics, including some of his own former advisors, say is fascist. The former president's vague, haphazard speaking style has triggered fierce debate over who specifically falls into the enemies group, especially after he floated using the military against radical left lunatics. He may not keep an official list, but a review of Trump's public remarks reveals a vast catalog of perceived enemies whom he has marked for imprisonment, prosecution, or other punishment. President Biden, shortly after his indictment by special counsel Jack Smith last year, Trump threatened to appoint real special prosecutors to go after Biden and his family. Vice President Harris, at a rally in Pennsylvania in September, Trump called for his opponent in the presidential race to be, quote, impeached and prosecuted for the Biden administration's handling of the border. Former President Obama, on Truth Social, Trump has reposted multiple calls for Obama to be arrested and face military tribunals. But Obama is a former president. And this is, by the way, this is the other thing. So much to unpack. Donald Trump has repeatedly over the years threatened to prosecute and called for the prosecution of Barack Obama. But Barack Obama is an ex-president. And hey, I thought Trump believes that ex-presidents should have absolute immunity. It's almost like he's an unprincipled loser and a liar who doesn't care about standards and doesn't care about principles and only wants presidential immunity for himself, but doesn't give a damn about other ex-presidents. And this is just so frustrating. But their shamelessness is their superpower. And by the way, MAGA doesn't care. MAGA doesn't care, and we see it in the polls. If you poll most Americans and say, hey, should presidents be entitled to absolute immunity? 70%. It should be like 97%. But 70%, a commanding majority, say, no, of course not. That's insane. But if you change it from president to just Trump, then the number of Republicans who go from opposing it to supporting it skyrockets. Because there is a shameless hypocrisy and cultishness, which is unique to the GOP that you do not see in the rest of America. Really gross. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, former Representative Liz Cheney. Going into examples, former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley. Media. ABC, after repeatedly being fact-checked in his September debate with Harris, Trump demanded that the Federal Communications Commission revoke ABC's broadcasting license. CBS, same thing. NBC. Trump called last year for NBC's parent company Comcast to be investigated for treason because of its coverage of his legal troubles. He promised that NBC would be, quote, thoroughly scrutinized for their knowingly dishonest and corrupt coverage if he's elected. Google, Mark Zuckerberg. Private citizens. He's talked about election workers as he lays the groundwork again to claim voter fraud if he loses. Trump recently delivered a wide-ranging threat to imprison, quote, lawyers, political operatives, donors, illegal voters, and corrupt election officials who engage in unscrupulous behavior. Election protesters, pro-Palestinian protesters, Supreme Court critics. Guys, the list goes on and on and on. There is no counterpart to this in the Democratic coalition. There's just not. That's a meaningful difference. And they do not care. They don't care. If you're relying on Republicans, especially Republican politicians, to have a sense of single standards and, to a sense of shame, you're gambling a hell of a lot. So again, I say, if you're an eligible voter in this country, make sure you have a plan to vote. If you are eligible, but you have not registered, many states, please look this up. Do a simple Google search, you and your state. Many states still permit same-day voter registration, meaning you can go to the polling place, register to vote, and vote your conscience same day. I encourage you to make a plan to vote. You still have time to do it, and let's make a difference because your vote matters. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.